My name is Heather Dawn Thompson, and I'm in the Office of the Secretary. I'm the Director of the Office of Tribal Relations. I'm a citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe in South Dakota. And I've been a practicing attorney in Indian country for 20 years. I am a former professor too, so I'd love to give you a 4-hour presentation, but I've got 20 minutes, so we'll make this happen. But what we're going to talk about is why consultation is so important. And then you're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to implement consultation. But before we really talk about how you do tribal consultation, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of why we do tribal consultation and a little framing. So I'm going to pull up my screen here. Okay, so we're going to talk about why consultation is important in the US Constitution. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the history of federal policy on food, which obviously affects all of us in the SNAP world, and why this history is so important to how we do our jobs today, from a implementation of a federal food program perspective in Indian country. So let's first talk about why in the world, what is tribal consultation and why is it so important? So it's important to think about how our government in the United States was formed. So tribal nations legally within the constitutional structure predated the creation of the United States. And we sort of all know that, right? We learned that in elementary school, of course. But what that means is they're not signatories to the Constitution. So unlike state governments, right, Massachusetts, Texas, California, we all went through a process as state governments to decide to become members of the United States government, sign the Constitution, and therefore we have democratic participation in Congress. We send 2 senators and we send representation through the congressional side, and we participate through the democratic process. That is not true for tribal governments in the same way it is for state governments. Tribal governments are not signatories to the Constitution. They are not participants in Congress and the constitutional democratic process, and therefore they are extra constitutional. And therefore we have a diplomatic relationship with tribal nations that US Supreme Court has held. They are domestic dependent nations. And we have to have our conversations and get our input from them, not through Congress, the way we do with states and state citizens, but through consultation. We have to directly meet with them in these diplomatic conversations and get their input into our policy decisions before we make those decisions. If we don't have that input, right, that can lead to all sorts of very drastic policy failures, of which the United States has done very well at in the past, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But just so you know, that's sort of the legal, constitutional, historical framing of why we have this, what's called trust and treaty responsibility for consultation now. So what are these sort of historical policies that the United States government, the federal government, has made in the past, these decisions that didn't include tribal nations, that did not incorporate tribal consultation, and what was the result? And why has this, it's largely been seen as unsuccessful and has put a heightened emphasis on doing more consultation now so that we don't have these lack of successes again. And so the land loss policies is one that all of us are the most familiar with, right? Most of the United States, all of the United States, all of your states, all of our states were at one point in time Indian country that were lost either through war or treaties or other agreements, executive orders. So we're all pretty familiar with that now. And for those of us that continue to have reserved lands within our state borders or reservations, we are very familiar with that reservation of land and the continuing tribal nations and their legal status as sovereign nations within those that just happen to be located within the exterior boundaries of a state. But there were a whole variety of federal policies that were made that didn't have anything to do with land, and actually had a whole lot to do with food. And so you don't have to remember what you see on the screen here. I just want you to know that there were huge waves in policy decisions that changed pretty dramatically over the years, that have led us to the point where we are today, where we have said as a nation, shoot, we have tried all sorts of different ideas and they have been wildly unsuccessful. We have tried to assimilate tribes. We have tried to put them on reservations. We have tried to make their governments like our Western governments. We have tried to terminate tribes. And all of them have resulted in tribal nations and tribal people that are less successful and less happy than they were before we intervened. And so we have decided as a nation, the federal government, that the best policy is one of self-determination, where instead of us trying to decide what is best for a tribe, that we should defer to them and have them make the decisions that are best for their nation and empower them to make decisions. And the same on our end. We should consult with them and get direct input on what they believe are the best for their tribal citizens and incorporate those policies into federal policy making. So let's look at what some of these decisions that did not incorporate input and consultation from tribal nations within the food context look like, and how that affects us today in our work within SNAP and other nutrition programs. So these are sort of 4 trends that are largely seen as the result of federal intervention in the food space. And we'll go into each of these 4 into more detail. And I'm going to use my own tribe, the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota, as an example. But you'll see these trends throughout Indian country. So the first is, destruction of indigenous foodways, which is a very common act of war, right? At the time, we were at war as a nation with Indian tribes, and the goal is to destroy another nation's access to food in order to prevent them from fighting back. The second is we then try to force tribal nations to adopt a Western style of farming, Western agrarian culture, instead of the indigenous farming or indigenous food sources that they were accustomed to. And then third, even though we were requiring them to adopt Western farming, we actually didn't provide the resources necessary to be successful in that space. And then fourth, we actually implemented formal punishment mechanisms for not becoming agrarian, and we'll talk very specifically about that. Okay, so this first one, what does that mean, destruction of indigenous foodways? For those of you in the Northwest, this is more focused on fish and salmon and criminalizing access to fishing in the manner in which tribes used to. But for me, for my tribal community in the South Dakota and the Great Plains, this was bison, right? So this was access to bison. And so it became a formal federal policy to sort of support destruction of the bison, which was the primary food source in economic trade for the Great Plains tribes. And this was done by not enforcing the treaties, which would have prevented non-natives from coming and hunting in the area. The trains supporting large hunting parties from going through the Great Plains and shooting off of the trains and destroying them in large percentages, large mass, and the forts for protecting the hunting parties when they were there, and the trade that was associated with that. And so by the late 1800s, all but 100 or so bison were pretty much annihilated, and this did in fact starve out the majority of the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota tribes from the region. Okay, the second federal policy that has affected our food space is the sort of forced adoption of Western farming. And what does this mean? I'll give you an example of my own tribe. So this is the state of South Dakota, and where you see the blue box is what's called the Black Hills, and this is a hilly or a more mountainous region. And this is where my tribe and most of the tribes in South Dakota spent a significant portion of their time, certainly in the winter, living, and their food sources were dependent upon the bison, which we just talked about how that became unavailable, and other foraging sources and some controlled indigenous agricultural processes. When the tribes were moved after gold was found, when the tribes were moved to the pink spots that you see now onto those reservations, it became a part of the treaties that the United States held the tribes accountable for becoming farmers. It was a part of the deal. We're going to move you here. We're going to have a peace agreement. We're not going to fight anymore. These lands are going to be reserved for you, and you're going to become farmers. We're going to provide the mechanical and agricultural instruction as necessary, and we're going to teach you how to become farmers. It was very explicit. This is true for much of the country. The treaties, the movement, the loss of land was very much tied to the deal that the tribes would become Western form farmers. So we've now moved the tribes in my region, and this is a pattern you see throughout the United States, away from the areas in which they're independently able to provide for themselves for food. We've moved them onto the reservations, and we've told them to grow food now in a Western way, monocropping and Western animals. But then we are not providing them the resources that are necessary for Western style agriculture. For example, this is a one for Colorado, Idaho, Kansas, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Oregon. What happened was, after the tribes were moved to the reservation, so you saw those very square, let me see if I can go back easily. Yeah, so you'll see this in a lot of your states, right? Like a very squared, delineated reservation. But even within that reservation, within those reservation boundaries, it was decided to sell off the most, the land that was the best for agriculture. And so this is what you see here in this sign going back. The most irrigated grazing agricultural farmland was sold off. So even within the reservation, which was already the least desirable land, that's why the tribes were moved there, the best land within that reservation for farming and ranching Western style was sold off to non-natives largely. So again, just using my reservation as one example, but this was repeated throughout the United States. You can see this is a map of my reservation. This is a plot map of my reservation. So everything on the Cheyenne River Reservation that is in gray is tribally owned, native owned trust land. Everything that is white is allotted fee land, individual non-native, largely non-native owned land. And so without me even telling you where the best water sources are, where the most best agricultural farming and ranching lands are, you can guess. And it's not necessarily in the gray lands. So now we have this, we've killed off as federal policy, we sort of killed off or cut off access to independent foraging, fishing, hunting resources, right? We've regulated it, we've made it illegal, or we've completely killed off that particular animal, whether it be fishing, bison, etc. We have said the deal is you're going to become a Western style farmer, but now we have made it very difficult to comply with that through land ownership, through the type of land that's available, etc. And now we've added this extra layer of complexity at the federal level by putting a form of punishment for non-compliance. So this is, again, one of my treaties. This is the last treaty moving my tribe out of the Black Hills. And you can see here on the bottom, it says no rations. So we've cut off the food source. You're dependent upon the federal government now, which is for rations to get your food, beef, flour, corn, but you're not going to be fed unless you send your children to boarding school and you are a farmer. So we already saw how hard it is to be a farmer, and it is tied to your ability to eat if you are not a farmer and if you are not complying by sending your child to boarding school. So here's an actual ration ticket, right? You would get X number of pounds of flour or beef a month or a week, and you would go and pick it up because we've cut off the other food sources at this point in time. And you had to be farming and you had to comply with sending your child to boarding school. Many of you become more aware, this is very traumatic for a lot of Native communities. The goal of the boarding school was full assimilation. The children were not allowed to speak their language or practice their religion, and were often their ties with their community and their parents were severed, and there was a very high mortality rate at the boarding school. Where I live most often with my family in the Rapid City area in South Dakota, we had one of these boarding schools. There was lots in Oklahoma. You can actually go to, there's lots throughout the whole United States. One of the last remaining ones was actually in Idaho. You can go to the Department of Interior's boarding school project website and learn more about it. But the whole theme of the boarding school was to kill the Indian and save the man. But you can see how directly related this very traumatic event for many generations was connected to food, was connected to agriculture, and is directly connected to our jobs and our profession in nutrition, in feeding people in Indian country and providing those services. So, you know, where does that bring us today? And how does this very complicated history, this hard history, affect our jobs and our responsibility to consult? So the legal reasoning, right, behind our responsibility for tribal consultation comes from a variety of different reasons. Right, we talked about the Constitution and the trust and treaty responsibility. And it's that constitutional responsibility, that historical responsibility that is sort of memorialized in all of these different things that we're looking at today. The executive order, which Jeff, could you put in the chat for me, please? 13175, which really talks about what meaningful consultation means. And Kathy will talk to you more about that. At USDA, we have written a series of really specific tribal consultation policies on what that looks like. And then of course you've got your SNAP-Ed tribal consultation policies on what that looks like. And some of them are very prescriptive, right? Like give everybody 30-day notice and give 2 weeks before, you know, to keep it open for send in written comments. And sometimes we lose sight of what all those rules are about. And in the end, those rules are to prevent all the things that we just saw, right? It's to provide an opportunity for tribal communities and tribal nations to really participate in a meaningful way in the decisions that we are making as policymakers. One of the examples I give, people sort of say, you know, what does that mean? What does meaningful mean? And how do I describe that? And what does that look like? And one of the examples I give is think of it like a staff meeting. You know, you have lots of different perspectives, and it's important for you to really sit down and have your staff be informed and give you guidance before you make a decision. And it's a collaborative group effort to think through those decisions. And it should be the same with the tribe. So you don't go consult with them after you've made a decision, right? You wouldn't do that with a staff meeting before you're deciding. So you want to be early enough in the process, far enough along so that you can have a concrete conversation. This is what I'm thinking. This is what it's looking like. But early enough in process that decisions haven't been made, so those tribal nations can really participate in the decisions that you're going to make, so that all of those heavy, poor decisions that you see in the past that come into the room, whether we like it or not, they're not our decisions, right? But they are a heaviness that comes with our history, don't get made again, so that we can make these decisions together in partnership in a really positive way going forward. So Kathy, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I really appreciate you inviting me to visit with you today before you go over your consultation rules.
I have a question.
Hi, Diana. Go ahead.
My name is Diana Driver. I'm the manager of SNAP-Ed here in Texas for the Health and Human Services Commission. And Heather, thank you so much for that presentation. And our team has been trying to develop our own protocol. And so thank you for the links. I'm trying to listen and look at all the various resources to look at later. So maybe these resources answer this question. So my question is, who do you think is most appropriate for consultation? And And being that point of contact, something we've come across with one tribe is they talked about government to government relations. And at one point I asked for clarification, and something they described was, I guess, meeting with higher ups. And so not necessarily at my level. So what is your experience with that? And what's your recommendation for who should be at the table?
It's a really great question. At the federal level, it is considered a nation-to-nation conversation or negotiation. And the highest executive at the tribal level and the highest executive at the federal level. So at its core, it's the president of the United States and the president of the tribe that have the government to government or nation to nation relationship, and it's delegated from there. And so obviously the president of the United States and the president of the tribe don't always have the time or the opportunity to be speaking with each other. And so it's often delegated by them to whomever is the decision maker. But our communications always go to the president or the chairman or the governor of the tribe, so the head executive of the tribe. And that person will decide on their end who is the right person for that consultation. It may be them themselves, it might be a fellow elected official, or they might delegate it or designate a proxy to speak on their behalf, the head of their SNAP program or FDIPR program or nutrition program, etc. For us, we require a formal proxy designation because it is a government to government relationship. Not just anybody who works for the tribe can speak on behalf of the tribal nation. And so the president or the governor or the chief would have to say, you know, Heather's my person. I've designated Heather to speak on my behalf. And here's the letter. So on our end, on Texas's end, it would be similar. It needs to be the person who is the decision maker. For example, sometimes I'm the decision maker, but sometimes I'm not, right? So I might not be the right person for the secretary to designate as the consulting official. It would be whomever is making that policy and is going to be the final decision maker. Because what tribes get very frustrated about, and what you might be hearing is, you know, they don't want to spend 3 hours talking to us and then at the end of the conversation say, that's really interesting, thanks, let me take that back to Frank and have Frank make that decision. If Frank is the person who's going to be making the decision, then Frank needs to be who the state of Texas designates as the consulting official and has present. Is that helpful?
That is helpful. And I think a challenge with Texas is, at least to our knowledge, we don't have a department in Texas, like a governmental department dedicated to liaisoning or consulting. And so, you know, SNAP-Ed, we've actually tried some consultations, no success yet, but we've gotten in, you know, the virtual room with tribal leadership, and our approach has been, okay, this is what SNAP-Ed can do. Here's our scope of our grant. You know, we want to offer this opportunity if you're able to leverage this funding. So that's where we've come from, is just what we can provide, and that's what we've done. But I can't help but, you know, it's got to be bigger than SNAP-Ed. And I know that one particular tribe did ask for government to government consultation. So it was helpful. I think we're just trying to navigate the complexity of the systems in which we are a part of, but aren't sometimes the decision maker, I think, that they want at the table.
No, that's a good point, Diana. And I'm glad you brought up the tribal liaison issue, because usually the tribal liaison is not the subject matter expert or the decision maker, right? The tribal liaison would be the diplomat, the person who's responsible for knowing the tribes, navigating that relationship, setting up the meetings, knowing Indian law, etc. But you would need whoever is in charge of the state nutrition program, the state SNAP-Ed program. who is going to be affecting the change or making the policy or designing the implementation of that program is going to be probably your consulting official. They're the decider, they're the decision maker, they're the policy maker. And they at the end should be the consulting official at the table for the government to government conversation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You bet.
Well, we do have a question in the chat box from Gabriella, and her question was, what are some strategies for approaching consultation when tribes are understandably reluctant?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gabriella, and we have the same reluctance at the federal level as well. And some states have really challenging histories with their tribes that come to the table. Some states have great relationships, but a lot of it is just like any other diplomatic situation. It's building that trust. We always encourage people to think of this more akin to being, the Department of State, and you're going to Japan, right? And what do you need to do to think about this from that perspective? It's a different culture, it's a different government, and it's different history, and it's a different level of trust. And so it's not the same as going to, a town in your state and doing outreach. It's just not. And so if you think of it more akin to diplomacy and in an international context, it's more comfortable to navigate and to navigate that reluctance. In a lot of cases, it's just takes time, and it's building trust and patience, and there's no easy way around it. And that's what we are doing at USDA. We have some pretty significantly broken relationships in a variety of different areas. One example is in some of our forests. A lot of our national forests are former treaty lands that belong to tribes that have very important cultural and sacred sites to them. And there's a reluctance to meet with us on consultation. And so we are just developing a plan of strengthening that relationship. And that includes going out to their reservation, sitting in on their meetings, going to their intertribal meetings, getting to know them getting to know us. All of these things are not formal consultations, right? They're relationship building. Going in and meeting with their natural resources department, getting to know them better. And so those are some strategies that you can think of as well. Just sending an email or just sending a letter to a tribe that you don't have a relationship with and say, hey, show up to a consultation in 2 weeks is probably not going to be effective, especially if your state as a whole has a strained relationship with your tribes. And so we would recommend thinking about it from a longer term perspective to build those relationships that would then lead up to that level of trust for good, effective consultation.